Thank you, Joan. Thank you, everybody. And I'm here to introduce Dr. Stacy Margarita Johnson. It's really a delight for me to introduce her. I had the privilege of speaking with her for a few minutes yesterday, and it was so energizing. So I imagine how it's going to be today. So Dr. Stacy Johnson comes to us from Vanderbilt University, where she embodies many, many roles. And so you have many of the titles in the bio there, so I'm not going to go through them. But I mentioned a few things is that she is the Assistant Director of Technology in the Center for Teaching there, which is extremely active. If you get on their web page, it's really laudable. And she's faculty in the Spanish and Portuguese department, where I hear she loves to teach the elementary courses, which is amazing. And she also has this open door policy that anybody can go visit her class and observe it and then leave feedback, which is amazing. And talk about effective filter here, right? And she also works for the English language program, and she is also for the Center for Second Language Studies. She's a consultant for language teachers and a pillar, I imagine, and I know actually from some colleagues at Vanderbilt. And just from the brief exchange I had, I asked a couple of things and she had so many pointers. It was amazing. She has published extensively 2 books, one on adult learning, one on hybrid learning, very relevant and useful in addition to theoretically valid, and numerous articles in critical pedagogy and social justice and language teaching. She has produced webinars, but I want to keep this brief, and I want to really draw your attention to a series of podcasts that she has on her website that is called We Teach Languages, where she interviews teachers from all over the country and talks about crucial points. So I invite you this weekend to go to We Teach Languages, and you will truly be inspired, and Monday have a changed lesson plan. It's really my honor and to welcome Dr. Stacy Johnson, and I invite you to welcome her. Thank you.
Hello. I'm really glad, Luciana, that you mentioned We Teach Languages, because you will, if you do become a listener, you will notice in the coming months that several of your Duke colleagues are going to be featured on the podcast. I arrived in town yesterday and I had the chance to sit down with a lot of different folks on campus and learn about the work you're doing and record some interviews with people who are doing really innovative things. It's not often that I get to talk about transformative learning with people who are so engaged in it, so have so much expertise, and are really putting the rubber to the road to see how these things work in language programs. So it's been a really wonderful learning experience for me so far, and I'm excited to share some thoughts about how transformative learning plays out in language classrooms today. So at best, we say that language instruction, which I think the Vice Provost made some of my big points for me actually in his introduction, but at best, language instruction connects students to multiple perspectives within the L2 communities that we teach about. It helps students develop intercultural competence, and in my view, it leads to true transformation, seeing the world in a new way, interacting with the world in a new way. And while most of us would say we believe that's happening in our classroom, I think the question of how is it happening on a day-to-day basis, what are the things that we do that actually help that happen, and how can we inform transformative learning in our classrooms without giving up any of the content goals that we have for our students? Because I don't know if you guys have a syllabus like mine, but my Spanish 101 syllabus is packed. There's no more room for any other learning except for what we already have planned in the course goals. So that's what I want to talk about today. My plan is first to give a little context, and I have to say, based on my conversations so far, I know I will be speaking to the choir. I apologize for telling you things you already believe, but I do want to give you a little bit of context about why I believe transformation is so essential in the language classroom on multiple levels. We're going to talk a little bit about the framework for those of you who aren't just digging into the details of transformative learning on a day-to-day basis. What is it? How does it work? What does the research tell us about how it happens for people? And then we're going to talk about teaching practices that contribute to transformation. And this is where I hope that we'll enter into more of a conversation where we can learn from each other and maybe share some of our ideas in the very limited amount of time that we have. I'm sure we can do it. I have faith. Oh, I'm also going to share a lot of examples from Twitter. If you happen to be on Twitter, there's a thriving community of language teachers who talk about hard issues. It's been one of my greatest experiences of professional development to engage with that online community on Twitter. So if you're on Twitter, please follow me, engage with me, let's continue this conversation online. And if you'd rather send me an email to talk about what you're doing, I would genuinely love to hear from you. So my email and my Twitter handle will be on every slide. Are any of you guys live tweeting this? Okay, I can't live tweet myself, so someone's gonna have to live tweet it. Okay. So the current language teaching context that we're in isn't so much about what's the state of multilingualism in the country, or what proficiency level can we expect for our students after they're through with a major. From my view, the current language teaching context is really about the climate that we find ourselves in, where many people have a very dualistic idea about language and culture. We don't understand languages as being things that coexist as tools for communication and for empathy and for growth. We understand languages as things you have or you don't. Cultures as things that are good or bad. So here's a few tweets. These are pretty old. It's from 2014, so a different age, but still really relevant. We still hear these kinds of things all the time. A multilingual version of the song America the Beautiful was part of a Coke commercial in the 2014 Super Bowl. I don't know if you can see by the timestamps, but all of these were sent February 2nd, 2014, right around 6:50. People were live tweeting their strong reactions to this commercial. I'll never drink Coke again. It's problematic for me that they thought the song was God Bless America. To a really staggering degree, it was America the Beautiful. Who thought of singing God Bless America in any language other than English? Who thought of that? What kind of a mind would think of something like that? The last one also, that Coke commercial is the stupidest thing I've ever seen. Just wrong, right? This is freaking America. I agree, this is freaking America. Okay, next one. I'm gonna try and get through these quickly, but on some level, if you are a transformative learning person, I do find them kind of charming. Because one of the things we know about transformative learning is that the early stages are associated with very strong negative emotions about these disorienting experiences we're having. And so I see thousands of people on Twitter going through disorienting dilemmas, and I'm rooting for them. Keep going, transformative learning is possible for you. Let's keep going. So some of us might say, oh, but that's on social media, that's not the real world. And it's true, social media is a heightened version of some of the divisions that we see in the real world. But maybe those kinds of things aren't happening in our sacred spaces like schools. So just a couple days ago, this gentleman, a PhD, posted that his 7-year-old, who is of Filipino and Alaskan heritage, came home with a book from his school called Disgusting Foods, in which Filipino and Alaskan traditional foods were highlighted and their culture specifically named as having disgusting food. His comment was, it's 2020 and the books in our schools are teaching our kids to be racist. Maybe it's not happening in our Spanish classes though, right? I'm a Spanish teacher. Maybe it's not happening in our Arabic classes. Maybe it's not happening in our language programs, because we are the ones teaching about empathy and multilingualism, right? So also just a few days ago, a teacher of mine, who I like to think of as one of my woke Twitter friends, she is always challenging me to think about things more deeply and to assess the materials I'm showing my students. She's a K-12 teacher. She displayed a book. Every single character in the book was written with unshaded skin, except for the bad guy. He's easy to pick out in the story, right? Very interesting, subtle message that this book is sending to the Spanish learners at the secondary level who are reading this book. Now, there's a reason I picked out these two examples of publishing and education specifically, And that's because these two publishing houses actually did an excellent job of responding to the online criticism. There are just innumerable examples of books that are sending these types of anti-multilingualism, anti-multiculturalism, racist messages to students, and unintentionally often, without even realizing that they're doing it. These two publishing houses happen to respond and really take responsibility and make some specific commitments to actions to do better. And so I wanted to highlight that also. That's not always how it goes, but these are good people. And I haven't mentioned higher ed yet. Like maybe we're hoping higher ed isn't doing that right, but we all know it is. We all use textbooks. We all understand that the textbooks we use are often problematic. In a recent study published in Spanish and Portuguese Review, Dr. Matthew Griffin explored the teaching of vos in Spanish language textbooks at the beginning and intermediate level. Vos is a pronoun that means you, singular, in Spanish. And in many countries, it's a stigmatized form. It's definitely not a prestige form in most of the 15 countries where it's spoken. And it is very rarely taught in textbooks at all. Whereas forms that might be used much less, but are prestige forms, are very widely taught in textbooks. And so he did an analysis of popular textbooks to see how they were treating both, and found that generally they're doing a terrible job. That's just one example of linguistic variation that our textbooks really are handling. A lot of our materials are bringing this context to us, so we don't have to go far to figure out why transformation is necessary in our classrooms, because the culture at large, the materials we bring into our schools, the materials we might even be using are bombarding us with these messages. And it's not just the materials. For me, this is where things get really serious. It's not just the world out there. It's not just the materials. It's our actual students. It's ourselves, but that's actually a different talk. This talk is about our students. Our students are bringing those assumptions into our classroom as well. So almost a decade ago, well, more than a decade ago, I conducted a study which later became one of those books called Adult Learning in the Language Classroom. And this is a quote from one of the students. I thought that somebody who is teaching in an American school should have English as their first language. I know that sounds ignorant, but with the accent, it's like I have to do a little more work to understand what she says sometimes, when I shouldn't have to. Other than Spanish, which I have to figure out, I also have to play with their English. This was a student in a first semester Spanish classroom who had a native speaker of the language as his instructor. And I don't think that he even realized that he was bringing that assumption into the classroom until he was confronted with it and had to go through some transformative processes around that. And I don't think the teacher ever realized that her students were bringing those kinds of assumptions into the classroom, because they wouldn't say something like that to her. They said it to a third-party researcher who seemed like maybe was a safe space to talk about those kinds of things. But that wasn't a conversation that was happening in the classroom. Here's another quote. This happens to be by the same student. I used to get really mad when I'd be driving and I'd see a billboard in Spanish. When the kids come in, so he worked at a zoo for a while, and when the kids came in, I'd be talking to the kids because the parents don't effing speak English. I used to get really annoyed when I'd see a commercial in Spanish. You know, the last time I checked, this was the United States of America. Just gonna point out some of the parallelism between the tweets we saw earlier and the sentiments expressed by this young man. Students are breathing in the culture and the assumptions and the attitudes of our larger culture. They breathe that out when they get into our classroom. All of that stuff comes with them. It becomes part of them. But our classrooms give them a space to breathe in fresh air, to breathe in something new. And that can be a really jarring experience for them. I'm happy to say that the reason the student was able to articulate his previous assumptions is because he learned how to challenge those in a language classroom. This is kind of a depressing slide, right? But there's some good news here. One of them is, the good news is that it seems like, from the research, that language classrooms provide students with a heightened opportunity to breathe in this different air, to experience something that challenges their previously held assumptions. We are going to later talk about disorienting dilemmas, where you say, this doesn't make sense with the world as I knew it before. I can't explain this with my previous assumptions and experiences. That's what this student went through, which is why he was able to articulate these previously held assumptions. Many of our students come in with these assumptions and they don't even realize they have them. So, what is transformative learning? Adults reevaluate previously held beliefs and attitudes and begin to interpret experience in a new way, in a nutshell. There's learning where you have a specific learning goal, you acquire knowledge and skills, now you have learning, right? That's not what this is. This is where you think about what you previously believed, explore it in some way, take deliberate action to reinterpret reality, and you begin to live in a new way. You begin to experience things in a new way. It actually affects your sense perception. The way you take in data through your senses and make sense of it, it affects that. Transformative learning is not, I actually find it kind of useful to talk about what transformative learning is not, to nail down what it is. It's not what we often think of when we think of transformation, which is like a butterfly who goes through that one-time inevitable process of transforming into what it was always meant to be, right? That is transformation in a cultural sense, but that's not transformation in a learning sense. Transformative learning is not a process of becoming something new or something inevitable. It's a slow, cyclical, developmental process of figuring out what you know about what you know and how you're going to act based on that knowledge. It's not inevitable. I like to say students have lots of mechanisms to avoid transformative learning. Adults have lots of mechanisms to avoid transformative learning. It's also not consistent across instances. So someone might go through many transformations in their life, and all of them might happen in slightly different ways. You and I might both go through the same transformation, but we experience it obviously through our own lens. It's also not a process that can be micromanaged or forced. So I, as a teacher, cannot force my students to transform or put into place a certain set of activities that will inevitably lead to transformation. So I kind of like to think that language acquisition is inevitable. Like, I'm going to get my students in this environment of rich, comprehensible, compelling language, and we're going to do the interaction that's required and the cultural work that's required, and language acquisition is going to be inevitable through those interactions, but transformation isn't inevitable. But there are predictable elements to it, and I think that's where we can start having a conversation about what it is. So I like to divide learning in my classroom into two categories. There's the instrumental learning, which is all the stuff that's in my syllabus. I have learning goals for my students, certain things I want them to acquire, certain things I want them to accomplish, certain skills I want them to develop, and I just put some of the most commonly used vocabulary here to describe those things. You might use cognitive language like declarative and procedural knowledge, what you know and what you can do. You might talk about your course content. You might talk about grammar, vocabulary, and the skills to use those in context. You might talk about learning and acquisition. Most of the debates about learning language that we have in our field actually fall into that instrumental category. The transformative things are changing my perspective, learning to see the world in a new way, learning to make sense of experience in a new way, critically reflecting on and adopting language ideologies. And a lot of what happens in our intercultural competence research is actually geared towards helping students see new perspectives, adopt new ways of being, that transformative learning. So for me, it's helpful to think about all the stuff that's in my syllabus that I can measure as instrumental learning, and transformative to be something else, something different. Traveling, others happen around parenthood, but in your experience, as someone who's been transformed and seeing your students transform in your classrooms, what kinds of activities promote transformative learning in your classroom? We're going to take just a few seconds to think about that, and then I'm going to ask you to turn to the person next to you and share, okay? All right, you have something? Make a group of 2 or 3 and see if you can suss out what kinds of classroom experiences do you think enact transformation for your students? Sorry, I walked away. I don't know what's I'm not a language teacher, so I can make it shit. I was teaching an honors class. My classes were really smart students, really invested in standards and there was one student who just But he, so a lot of people talk too about white and that is just very hard. So he had an emotional reaction when he left the class and in my office. That was and then I just went to another class and then I just and I went to we do a very simple exercise and students in our All right, I'm sorry to interrupt these awesome conversations. No! One more minute? I'm overruled. To share out, but I have a criteria. I would specifically like to hear you share out about things you found in your group that you had in common. Learning activities or classroom activities that you said, yes, that is also something that I find transformative for my students. Anyone willing to volunteer? Yes.
Among the things we talked about was that sometimes it's useful to, when students are frustrated with the target language, to point out that English is, kind of annoying too. And, because you don't want them to feel like Italian's so frustrating. Yeah. No, language is complex and we don't have, most people, our students don't have a good understanding of it. So it's not Italian. It's this fascinating thing about language. And then let's be curious about how Italian deals with it versus, instead of their frustration that it's not the way I expected it.
I love that. So what I heard is helping them make connections to their own experience and then be curious about how things play out in a range of circumstances. And I think that's a really widely applicable principle to specific language features, but also to cultural features and other aspects of their lives. Anyone else? Anything that your group found, oh, we have something in common?
Let them share their experiences and hear others' experiences as well, because maybe they think about a certain idea in a specific way. They won't change and listen until somebody would challenge them and ask them, like, why don't you think it the other way as I think, and that maybe start that transformation process.
I like that a lot. Asking students to specifically surface their own experiences. If they don't understand their experiences and assumptions that they're bringing into the classroom, it's harder to challenge them. And then to carefully listen and understand other people's perspectives as well. I would especially focus on that when we're talking about perspectives from the L2 community. So for me, when we look at authentic resources that deal with L2 community members, our focus on listening to understand someone else's perspective is even greater. I love that. Anything else? Yes, ma'am.
So I'd like to follow up on what the first speaker said. I teach Romanian, and so for my students, this is like a second Romance language that they are learning. So they all know some Spanish, French, Italian, and so what I'd like to do with them is, of course, because they are frustrated, is to always point out, and sometimes I give them, charts, what happens in other Romance languages. So they see that even, Spanish and Italian or French, they are not the same. And of course, Romanian is going to be different. So you just have to make a little room for one more, variable in your,
Making a little room is actually one of my mottos with transformative learning. Since we can't micromanage it and we can't force it, finding ways to make a little room for ambiguity, for reflection, for thinking through hard problems is I love that specifically. The whole thing was great. Did you have something you wanted to say?
We didn't have much in common.
Really? Oh, that's interesting. Well, just really briefly, tell me kind of how your conversation played out then, since you didn't have much in common.
I would say that, I think for my colleague, it's mostly about the content is so different, and it takes a lot of mediation from her really to get them through it. And for me, my experience would follow especially with peers. So when they have interaction with peers, I think they really, especially at Duke, they really check to see if they're in the ballpark or not. And so I think I've learned that peers are often way more effective than I am at getting them to question.
I love that. Okay, I'm going to move on because I want to show you really quickly. We're not going to learn all of these. There's no quiz on this afterwards. But I wanted to display the godfather, or the originator of the particular framework that we're looking at for transformative learning. His name's Jack Mesro, and he, in his research mostly with adult women who are returning students over many, many years, he identified 10 steps, and these have been sort of recurring in the literature for the last 40 years. Now, these 10 steps aren't in a particular order. Not everyone goes through them in the same way, but these are like 10 touchstones of the process. And understanding what these touchstones are can be useful for language teachers because we can kind of know what to look for in our classroom to gauge where our students are at. I heard a lot of you mention that students might be frustrated or might be experiencing negative feelings, and that's actually way up top at step 2. Is those negative feelings associated with self-examination and really thinking through something new and hard. And so it can give you just a sense of where they are and maybe what some next useful steps would be for them. But I like to think of this chart in a slightly different way. You'll notice that number 1 is having that disorienting dilemma. So making sure that there are opportunities to name and explore disorienting dilemmas is pretty important to me. That's a big deal. But the things that I have highlighted in red represent what are internal reflective processes associated with transformative learning. And the experiences highlighted in blue represent relational or social or group experiences. I like the word relational because it's not enough to just be in a group. You have to actually develop relationships with the people in your group, which can be something that's hard to do in the context of a college classroom, right? So we know that transformation can't be micromanaged, we can't force it, but if we think about, okay, so there's some really big steps that have to do with reflective internal processes, some really big steps that have to do with relational connective processes, and the feeling from the room that we got from our small conversations and then the share out really reflect that as well. Like we intuitively are already seeing our students go through these reflective processes of connecting their own experience to what they're learning in the classroom, and the relational process of comparing their experiences to others, of developing empathy, of caring about people who are in their peer group. So let's look at, we don't have that much time left, so I'm just gonna go through some categories of learning experiences that might fit into these. Disorienting dilemmas. In the literature, sort of reoccurring contact with L2 communities, and I would include both in person through place-based learning or community engagement or service learning or all those many types of learning experiences that put students in real contact with communities. But I would also include anything that involves authentic resources. Anytime we allow L2 community members to speak for themselves and we learn about them as resources, when we center people who are speakers of the language, we're giving our students the opportunity to care, to develop empathy, to develop knowledge of people who, frankly, my Spanish 101 students, I don't want to let them loose onto an L2 community right now. They're not prepared with the cultural competence they need or the linguistic tools they need to interact effectively with those communities. But what in the same study that I talked about earlier, one of the things that they did in class was to watch a film. It was a film where one of the points of the film was to develop a lot of empathy for the main characters and to really understand what they had been through. And it was a momentous learning experience for the students that I would put on par with actually having met those people and developed real relationships with them. So contact with L2 communities is just so essential. A sanitized textbook will not give our students that contact that they need. It's really up to us to make sure that's happening. Number 2, exploring cultural and linguistic differences, which was also something that was talked about in the room. This doesn't necessarily mean doing big grammar lectures or doing big culture lectures and showing them the differences, but asking them to think the differences through, to notice the differences. So it can be very small, sort of seconds interjected into a classroom, not minutes, not hours, but just seconds interjected to draw attention to differences. And also confronting one's own limitations as a language learner, which is another thing that came up. Language seems like it's one of those things that we shouldn't have to work hard at. Like, don't we all already speak a language? Why is it so hard? And so confronting our own limitations as language learners in the classroom can be a real source of transformation as well. Okay, the second category, so that's number 1 thing, disorienting dilemmas, gotta have those to move on. But then we have that whole group of highlighted in red internal reflective processes, exploration of one's own emotional and rational responses. When our Twitter friends are having irrational responses, highly emotive responses to God Bless America or whatever song they're listening to, I honestly think that posting those things on Twitter, having other Twitter users kind of call them out and be like, hey, that was a little racist, what are you doing here? And engaging in that back and forth conversation is probably one of the most useful things those particular people could have done at that moment, instead of just taking their escape hatch and being like, Coke stinks. They talked about it, they named it, they wanted to talk through it. And when our students are having those heightened experiences, giving them quiet places where they can record those experiences. We don't want our classrooms to turn into free-for-alls where everyone talks about every bad thing they're experiencing in our class. But it's possible to create quiet spaces, maybe online spaces, maybe journaling spaces, where we ask students to talk through some of those heightened experiences. Critical assessment of one's own assumptions. Corey has talked a lot about how her prompts, not today, but in our conversations, I've learned a lot from Corey about specifically asking students to name their assumptions at the beginning of a course. I mean, that's awesome. We can't examine our assumptions until we've surfaced them. And charting trajectory and planning next steps. A lot of people say, well, that's not reflection. It's something like reflection is looking back, but charting next steps is looking forward. But I actually believe that this is a type of reflection because we have to understand the path that we've been on and see what our trajectory is from there in order to see where we need to move next. So asking students to say, this happened and then this happened, what are you gonna do to resolve it? Can be a really useful type of critical reflection as well. And also, speaking of Corey Crane, very recently published article in the Foreign Language Annals all about structured reflection in the language classroom leading to transformative learning that I just had the opportunity to read last night, and it's really good, has a lot of detail. So if you're interested in structured reflection as a way to create a little room for these internal experiences, I highly recommend it. And finally, we have the relational processes. So giving the students the space to recognize membership in a group of peers. Our students are doing hard work in our classrooms and figuring out how to create group membership in that room, how to help students understand that we're in this together, that this isn't a competitive environment, that language is inherently interactional, and we can only do language with each other. We can't do it by ourselves. We can only do it with each other. Can be really useful for students. One of the stages in transformative learning is actually understanding that other people are also on the same transformative path you are, and that you're not alone in this experience. And the classroom's an ideal place to set that up. Another relational process is forming new relationships and new roles. Particularly, we're talking about meeting people from the L2 community or meeting people who are also interested in language and having social spaces where you can geek out about this fun adventure that you're on. You know the transformative process that often happens on a study abroad where our students try out new roles, explore being slightly different people than they are back home? That's an incredibly useful process for transformation. It's one of the most important things that you can do. Give it a try. See if it fits. It might or it might not, but the fact that you're trying something outside of your original meaning perspective is a real move forward. So giving our students space to explore new roles here on campus, in the language center, or in our classroom can be a great relational process as well. I just want to go back to this one student that I mentioned up front because I don't want you guys to think that he left the class the same person that he started. He had an intensely transformative experience in his first semester Spanish course. One of the things he said is that he used to feel really angry every time he would encounter multilingualism or multiculturalism in his real life. And he said, I don't have the random anger that I had before. Now, as opposed to getting mad when I hear Spanish, I try to, more than anything, pay attention because I kind of want to figure out what they're saying. It's kind of flipped. I don't shun it like I did before, and a lot of that has to do with the instructor's presentation of who she is and how it's being presented to me in a way I'm seeing it's a positive thing. His transformative experience was relational. It was also reflective. It caused a series of disorienting dilemmas, and that class happened to make room for him every day to have a quiet moment to think about what he had learned and what it meant for him. And it was life-changing. If you guys have any comments or questions, or if we need to get to the next activity, I'm not sure what comes next. Someone tell me what to do. Yeah, any comments or questions, I'm happy to field them.
Yeah. I think we have time for a few questions.
You said you were showing the students some movies to teach them empathy. I was curious what kind of movies you showed them.
That was not me, actually. That was the teacher that I was researching. So I did a case study of her classroom. And in her first semester Spanish classroom, she asked them to watch the English language movie In the Time of the Butterflies outside of class. They watched a few scenes inside of class, and then they did some target language work with those scenes. But the movie was in English, and the Mirabal sisters were incredibly inspirational for most of the students that I talked to, particularly the Black women in the classroom had a really powerful experience of connection with those women, and it was fun to see how the 4 Mirabal sisters really became like 4 extra students, like 4 extra teachers in the classroom.
Okay, well, you'll have a chance to speak with Stacy throughout the day.
I'll be here all day.
So please approach her, and we're gonna move to start at their 10 o'clock session. Rubenstein 241 is down the stairs to the right. 249, excuse me, or